A question every psychologist stumbles upon during their career is, what exactly is a mental illness actually? Are we not all a little abnormal? And who defines whom as mentally ill? Are mental disorders perhaps merely cultural labels for people who do not fit into our worldview? These are the precise questions I will be addressing in this video. We will explore why mental illnesses are more than just unusual behavior, but also where the limitations and perhaps even philosophical problems with our current classification systems and understanding of mental illnesses lie. And with that, welcome. My name is Tim. I'm a psychology student from Germany and an independent writer on Substack. If topics around psychology, philosophy, or neuroscience interest you, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Without further ado, let's get to it. So, first of all, let's look into the history of how we classified mental illnesses to, know where we are currently at. A systematic classification of mental illnesses in the modern sense did for a very long time not exist. Mental illnesses were primarily explained in spiritual or moral terms, such as divine trial or consequence of possession. Only with the Enlightenment and the modern era did a more humane and scientific understanding begin to develop. And this scientific approach finally took a form in the 19th century. In 1883, the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin published the first edition of a textbook that would grow over 9 editions and more than 4 decades into one of the most influential classification systems in psychiatry. He observed that certain symptoms occurred in clusters as syndromes, and that these clusters tended to repeat in recognizable patterns. Although effective treatment remained largely unknown, it was possible for the first time to describe the cause of an illness systematically. It took until the 6th edition in his textbook in 1899 for Kraepelin to fully separate severe mental disorders into 2 main categories. The first, dementia praecox, which is basically an early term for schizophrenia, and manic depressive psychosis, an earlier term for bipolar disorder and a bit of depression. Again, his theories were still not correct and not really scientific, but it was an important starting point. In the aftermath of the World Wars especially, and the treatment of psychological distress in soldiers, systematic classifications increasingly emerged and became even more scientific. From these emerged the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the ICD, that is the International Classification of Diseases, which also includes mental illnesses, and both are somehow trying to similarly categorize mental illnesses into certain groups of syndromes, and both are categorical. Importantly, there are small differences between the 2 systems, but largely they understand mental illnesses in the same way. Over time, these classifications became increasingly differentiated and empirically validated. And so we had valid constructs we can use for treatment and diagnosis. So for this, I'll just get straight to the point and the standard definition of mental illnesses. The ICD-11 and the World Health Organization define a mental illness as follows. Mental, behavioral, and neurodevelopmental disorders are syndromes characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes that underlie mental and behavioral functioning. These disturbances are usually associated with distress or impairment in the personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. This means for a behavior or condition to be classified as ill, there must be an impairment in the life of the affected person or the social environment, often over a certain period. For example, that might be 2 weeks. Similar to physical illnesses, though, this is also based on a real functional limitation, in this case, psychological, biological, or developmental processes that underlie behavioral functioning and the impairment we can observe. Furthermore, modern clinical psychology understands disorders, and this is very, very important to understand, through the biopsychosocial framework. That means we always need to look at the biological foundation, psychological and social factors, because all of those interact. For example, a mental illness might come with an impairment in social life. And so to treat this illness, we also need to look and maybe change the social environment of a person. So all of these factors are always seen as interacting with each other, and an illness is indeed always embedded in a certain social environment. So now we know the standard definition of mental illnesses. Still, another problem psychologists often face is explaining the difference between mental disorders, mental illnesses, and disabilities. Those terms are just thrown around. So what is the difference between those terms actually? So the difference lies in the nuance of how and when to use them. Illness or mental illness emphasizes the subjective suffering and impairment of the person affected, which results from a dysfunction, while disorder more often strongly describes the clinically observable dysfunction itself from which the suffering arises. An illness is therefore a disorder that is so severe that it significantly impairs a person's ability to function normally. Thus, for example, Professor Andreas Heinz in 2015 writes, "A clinically relevant illness can only be diagnosed if, from a medical perspective, there is a disturbance of functional abilities relevant to the survival of the individual, and there's either subjective suffering from the illness or activities of daily living and other social participations are impaired." Now, these mental illnesses can become chronic, meaning they persist over longer periods, and in cases of long-lasting and intensive impairment in multiple areas of life, they can also be classified as a mental disability. The decisive factor here is just the time. So now I think we have understood all the terms. Let's get to a few challenges for this understanding. So are mental disorders just objective, universal facts? A frequently voiced criticism of this standard objective definition of mental illnesses is the labeling theory according to Thomas Scheff. It states that mental illnesses cannot be objectively determined, but rather that societal attributions push people into the role of the mentally ill person. Patients receive diagnostic labels and their behavior is then co-shaped by this social role in this context, according to Thomas Scheff. And Thomas Sass, in The Myth of Mental Illnesses, even writes that whoever first applies the label of the mentally ill to someone effectively decides that person's social fate. And so, depending on who takes power and defines what as mentally ill, a social construction of mental illnesses, so Thomas Sass tries to say, emerges. So the one doing the defining holds power over the one being defined. Now, this is of course a bit overly dramatic, but there's at least, I think, some truth to it. It is of course true that our society is continuously influenced by ideas of what is normal and what is abnormal behavior. And the classification of illnesses is also because we look at behavior and we socially evaluate behavior, partly fed by this. Certain actions that are, for example, considered deviant are perceived as disruptive to society or the person affected, naturally also depend on how the behavior is socially evaluated. While an action that might be considered problematic or restrictive today might have been evaluated very differently 100 years ago. So diagnostic criteria can, at least a bit, change historically or culturally. This means it is true that normative ideas, so behaviors we regard as normal or abnormal, are in certain way socially relative. But there's also an opposing perspective, for example from Walter Goff. He strongly criticized this approach and argued that mental illnesses exist completely independently of societal attributions and thus representing more objective conditions. Many critics may also say that labeling theory overlooks the fact that mental illnesses just cause real suffering. If one regards illnesses as merely a social deviation from the norm, there is a risk of trivializing the mental illness. Along the lines of, if it is not a problem at all, a real problem, why just not do anything about it? It's just societal mood. And even if one sees labeling as a social construction, norm violations that create real suffering in the person or environment around the person do not disappear just because we stop naming them, So the diagnosis also helps, in a way, just to name reoccurring patterns of suffering that are historically observable and somewhat stable. So even if it were just a social construction, we still need that diagnosis because factually people don't feel well and we need to treat that. It is also important to understand, and I place particular emphasis on this, that mental illnesses are characterized by real neurobiological dysfunctions. So let me elaborate this a bit with the example of the neuroscience of depression. In this section, I'm drawing from an overview from Dean and Kashavan in 2017. By the way, all references of this paper and all the other papers I'm using here and my own article are always linked in the description. So just take a look there. So let's start with the oldest and most well-known idea about depression. The brain runs on chemical messengers, or we call them neurotransmitters. And in depression, some of those messengers are out of balance. 3 of them matter the most: serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine. And in earlier theories, they especially focused on an imbalance in serotonin level. Together, these transmitters help regulate our mood, our motivation, and our sense of energy. So when they are depleted and there is an imbalance or are not signaling properly, you get exactly the symptoms that we associate with depression. No mood, no motivation, no energy, and so on. For instance, depressed people tend to respond less strongly to drugs that boost dopamine than healthy people would. That is a hint to the fact that something in the system doesn't seem to be right. This is also the logic behind classic antidepressants. Many of them work by keeping these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft between the neurons for a longer period instead of letting them get reabsorbed too quickly. More messengers in the cleft means the next neurons get signaled properly or strongly, and for a lot of people that will improve mood. That said, this chemical imbalance is not the whole story. Later research found that depressed people do not reliably show, for example, low serotonin levels. So shortage of these chemicals can't be the whole explanation. It's clearly part of the picture, just not all of it. Some researchers now think about the problem more broadly. Depression may indeed reflect that the brain's network is not processing information correctly, so there's maybe at a holistic network level just a depletion of connections. Now, when we zoom out from chemicals and messengers to whole brain regions, we also find an interesting pattern. The amygdala, also important for processing emotional threats, but not only, but that's another topic, tends to be overactive in depression, making people more sensitive to negative emotional triggers. Meanwhile, the region that are supposed to help regulate and calm that alarm system down, so prefrontal regions, for example, often aren't really doing their job properly, or there's even an anatomical change. Then there's also the body's stress system called the HPA axis. Now, this is a very long combination of words I can say in English, but I'll just, it will show up here somewhere. And it's supposed to release cortisol, the main stress hormone, when we are under threat, and then bring us down again. In depression, you can think of this system as getting stuck, switched on, so cortisol stays chronically high. And chronically high cortisol is actually toxic to brain tissue over time. And so long-term depression is therefore linked to a smaller hippocampus, brain region that is, for example, important for memory, and to a physical shrinkage in parts of what I just said, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional regulation. Now there's more I could get into here, problems with inflammation, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and how all of these interact. And what I've just said is even a very simplified picture, just to make that clear. But I think the main point should be clear now. That is that depression isn't something that is just deviant social behavior or deviant mental state from the rest of society. It involves real, measurable disturbances in the biological systems we observe. There's a deeper assumption that we need to drop now. That is the idea that mind and body are two separate things. That idea goes back to Descartes 400 years ago, I think, and it is called Cartesian dualism. And I think it's still baked into our culture and our even Western medicine. It's part of why psychological problems so often get treated as something less real than physical illnesses, as if they are more optional or more within one's control or controllable by sheer willpower. That's not true, of course, exactly because patterns like the ones we have just discussed exist and are as real as a broken arm. Now, the problem with dualism is this. If the mind is one kind of thing and the brain is a completely different kind of thing, how do they ever interact? How does a thought supposedly made of no physical stuff at all reach down and, for example, move a physical arm? Or how does it change the brain chemistry at all? In my opinion, that is why, and that is called the interaction problem, nobody, or no expert at least, or not so many experts, think that dualism doesn't really make any sense. And most psychologists too do not hold this view for this exact reason. But still, there's a residual belief in many people that the mind is somehow something of a different substance. So what does it mean to not have a dualist but monist picture of mental illnesses? Monist meaning that there's just one singular reality, for example, one physical or one mental reality. Well, it's actually not that easy to answer what that means. First, I'm not trying to claim that the mind is nothing but brain chemistry, or that your experience of sadness somehow is just cortisol or a shrunken hippocampus and nothing more. That's a much stronger and more contested claim about eliminativism and physicalism. I just want to make that clear. But I think that we need to accept that there are no two separate substances called the mind floating apart from the body, causally disconnected from it, waiting to be reunited each morning. Whatever the mind ultimately turns out to be, it's not a second independent thing. Instead, I think we can think of it like this. Psychology and neurobiology are just different descriptions or two different levels of language and perspectives for looking at the same underlying reality. Neurobiology describes it in terms of neurons, or brain circuits, and chemistry, and psychology describes it, or the same reality, in terms of thoughts, moods, and behavior. And then part of that is also your first-person experience, so what it actually feels like from the inside to be sad or afraid or in love. And that's not, a separate thing, it's just a different form of abstraction. It's simply what the same reality, when we now look in a brain scan, looks from a different perspective of another person, but it doesn't mean that the mind or mental illness is somehow floating above and can't be assessed with science. So one reality looked at from the outside, that's the biological angle, one from the inside, and that's the psychological angle, and part of that is also your first-person perspective, and two ways of engaging with a single thing, not two separate things. And that's really all we need to establish here. It doesn't mean we have to be a physicalist or to be an idealist or panpsychist or whatever. I just want you to accept that there is no brain and mind or physical body and mind that are distinct, because it just makes it really hard to even talk about mental illnesses as anything that is classifiable in any way. So one isn't less real or less able to be heard than the other. That said, there are still real problems with how we classify psychological dysfunctions, and I want to be upfront about 3 of them. The first problem is we can't yet see most of the dysfunctions directly. Unlike a broken arm, where an X-ray shows you the break in a second, we don't have a fast, direct way to point at the damage inside of someone's brain. So, for example, we can't just do an MRI and say, there it is, there's the depression. It's not working that way. This is a limitation, I think, of the current tools, though, not a flaw of the underlying assumption that mental illnesses are real, part of nature, and as real as a physical illness. The dysfunction is either there or it isn't. Whether or not our instruments today are good enough is really not relevant to this, but still it's a problem for everyday use. Problem 2 is, it's genuinely hard to say what counts as a dysfunction, especially in the brain in the first place. With a bone, when it's broken, it's very easy to define, but with the brain, what does malfunctioning or a dysfunction even mean? One useful answer would be an organ is dysfunctional when it fails to do what it was naturally selected for. So for the brain, it's things like regulating emotions, holding together a stable sense of the self, and accurately processing what's happening around you. I think it's reasonable to say if somebody can't assess their reality and is hallucinating because something is wrong, there's at least some notion of a real dysfunction similar to a broken arm. Problem 3 is, because we usually can't look inside the brain directly, we have to classify based on what somebody tells us or how they behave. And that inevitably lets culture and social norms again creep in. Since diagnosis relies on language, a person describing how they feel, a clinician observing how they act, rather than direct biological readings, it's obviously shaped by vocabulary, expectation, but also social norms of whatever culture that conversation or diagnosis happens in. It has to. And that's a limitation, but I think it doesn't mean, again, that the underlying dysfunction isn't real. It just means our access to dysfunction is less direct than with a broken arm. But again, the tool being imperfect doesn't mean it doesn't track something real in nature. Now, on top of this, dysfunction only becomes an illness, according to the framework we have discussed, when it leads to an impairment. And that impairment, what we observe, is necessarily part of that definition. For example, Professor Andreas Heinz again writes, a person should only be regarded as unwell if this organ dysfunction results in harm to that person. But just to make that clear, it's not that different with physical illness, because there can still be biological deviations that are not causing problems. For example, a harmless cyst in, your hand, if it doesn't change anything about your life, you don't suffer from it, it also wouldn't be classified as an illness. The same logic applies to the mind. Dysfunction without real-world harm is not an illness. And so that is always important for the definition too. This universality is logical from an evolutionary perspective again, because normal psychological functioning provides a clear survival advantage and is typically the product of a healthy, normal functioning nervous system. So while this assessment can be influenced by culture, I think it's pretty clear that some psychological functions are or can always be seen as, impaired. Again, take the person with the hallucination that can't assess reality. That is pretty much always a bad thing, and it pretty much always impairs a person. And this mirrors the harmful dysfunction analysis by Wakefield. This is, by the way, something I found after writing the article in this video script. So, just I didn't want to copy him completely. And Wakefield writes, because he puts it so beautifully, according to the harmful dysfunction analysis, a condition is a disorder if it is negatively valued, so harmful, and it is in fact due to a failure of some internal mechanism to perform a function for which it was biologically designed, i.e. naturally selected. This also explains some cases which we would expect to be an illness, but in reality are not a real illness. For example, sometimes people react to something like a traumatic event, think of, a car crash, with real intense negative feelings, but there's no underlying dysfunction here, because often it's just a normal system doing exactly what it's supposed to do under abnormal circumstances. Sometimes it's normal to react extremely to something like a traumatic event. Of course, some people react maladaptively, they cannot cope with it, then it becomes chronic. That would be an illness because it is then a dysfunction. I hope that makes sense. And before we end this section, I just want to make clear that the theory I've just laid out, so the harmful dysfunction theory, is of course contested. So just to make this clear, people are actually, and this might be the first conclusion of this video, far less certain about what an illness or mental illness actually is than you would think. And it comes down to really philosophical, metaphysical assumptions you hold. And I've just presented you one possible view, which I think is internally consistent and makes sense. Now, all of this raises another obvious question. If mental illnesses do not fit into these neat fixed categories because the underlying psychobiological system isn't built that way, why do we still use classification systems like the DSM or ICD at all? Because there's simply no single depression. So why classify it like there is a single depression? The reason is relatively simple. They are just the best methods that we currently have to classify and use treatments with certain mental illnesses. So these categories are more functional tools than an accurate description of reality. They allow us to meaningfully distinguish between different forms of treatment. We know, for instance, that certain forms of therapy work with schizophrenia, but they might not so well work with depression. The same applies to medication or diagnosis. even though the boundaries between disorders or mental illnesses are often fluid, recurring patterns can still be observed, and symptoms, syndromes, and factors that differ systematically can be assessed. So yes, ICD and DSM do not perfectly capture mental illnesses at all, but they are the most functional tool there is. And I think they will continue to develop alongside our growing understanding of dysfunction and impairment. Now, just to be clear, there are already some dimensional models that arguably capture reality more accurately, and they could, in principle, of course, become the better tools in future. This is, of course, not excluded. So where does this leave us? Mental illnesses are not merely social construction the way labeling theory might suggest, but they are also not fully objective either. And to be fair, neither are most physical illnesses if you really push the definition hard enough. But mental illnesses are still a bit more complicated. They sit in a necessary middle ground. They are rooted in real, observable regularities of human biology and psychology, but shaped and understood through cultural and linguistic frameworks we are forced to use to make sense of them. So, what is a mental illness? A mental illness is a clinically significant harmful dysfunction of psychological functioning understood within a non-dualist organism that results in significant distress, impairment, or harm. In the end, I just want to leave you with this. As with most things in this field, it is just extremely complex, and there is not one right answer to the question. But I hope this gives you a clearer sense of what a mental illness actually is.